technical issues here. It was saying that we weren't due to start in an hour. I'm not sure if we might have scheduled it incorrectly on YouTube. But anyway, we'll address that later, guys. Hope you are all well today. We'll get right into it. If you guys haven't checked out the new website, definitely do so, georgegammon.com. It just went live a few days ago, and there's a lot of content. It is a fire hose of content. We're still working with the navigation to clean it up a bit. It's kind of in beta testing, but definitely go check that out. And if you're not on the email list, subscribe, because we'll be doing some exclusive content. I've been uploading some raw videos that are unedited where I talk directly to the email list, but we've got a lot of other things planned. So after the live stream, check that out. Let's go straight into the questions, Sebastian. We're dealing with StreamYard again. Okay, here we go. So Andre, thank you for the super chat. Why did Japan's history of extreme QE not trash their currency? Could you recommend any books, talks on from the non-Keynesian perspective? All right, well, first and foremost, what you need to do is go on YouTube as soon as we get done and watch The Princes of Yen. Like, you got to watch that. It's not optional. I've been watching that this morning because I've been getting ready for the Real Vision interview coming up next week with Hugh Hendry and Richard Werner. And I can't wait. But in anticipation of the interview, I wanted to watch the YouTube documentary, Princes of Yen, which is based on Werner's book. And if you've got any questions on Japan, how their extreme QE didn't trash the currency, anything regarding Japan and how it may be different or similar to what we may go through in the United States, you got to check out that documentary. But to answer your question specifically, the way they did quantitative easing, from what I've heard from Warner in his interviews, was a lot different than how they did it in the United States. And also, even their quantitative easing they did in Japan or the United States, it didn't really get money into the real economy. I was watching Jeff Snyder's latest podcast on his YouTube channel at Alhambra, and he was talking about, he talked about at great length, how bank reserves are pretty much worthless other than to banks. They can't really, you can't do much with them. So you can't pay your rent. You can't really do anything with a bank reserve. So even if there's 1.5 trillion in excess reserves, probably more now, since they've done all these programs and more quantitative easing recently. But regardless of how much is in excess reserves in the bank accounts held at the Fed, these primary dealer banks, it doesn't really do anything if the primary dealer banks don't take action. So they could do 100 trillion in quantitative easing. And well, if there were enough assets to buy, then there could be 100 trillion in excess bank reserves through quantitative easing, let's say, and it wouldn't create any inflation. In fact, it may even create deflation if you look at what it would do to interest rates. So you've got to ask yourself, just because they're printing money, are they printing money in the form of bank reserves, or are they printing money, which they've never done, by literally sending people checks in the mail, which would increase bank deposits? So that's a completely different ballgame there. So are those bank reserves getting into the real economy? The transfer mechanism has to be the big banks. And then there has to be demand, right? To a certain degree. If you watch the documentary that I was referring to, The Princes of Yen, you'll see that even if there's no demand, sometimes the banks will create demand. Very similar to what we did in the United States in 2004, 5, and 6 with the housing bubble. There wasn't really much demand for those loans. But the banks were creating the loans through the political rules that were coming down the pipeline and Wall Street. And I mean, every party was guilty in there, but they were, your average McDonald's worker had 3 or 4 loans for $1 million properties. And it was the exact same thing in Japan in the late 1980s. So that's how their bubble really came to be. And my point is that's a case where the bank reserves are being utilized, and not that they're lending bank reserves, but they're using them as their reserve requirement to create more loans. But if there's no more loans being created, then you could do a quadrillion in QE if there were the assets, and if they just stayed in bank reserves, it doesn't do anything. That's why in that one video, I don't know if you saw it, but I used the example of what I called the Fed bed. And the Fed bed is just their mattress. And if they print a quadrillion bank reserves and just stuff it under the mattress in the Fed bed, it doesn't matter. It doesn't get out into circulation. As far as could I recommend any books from a non-Keynesian perspective? Well, sure. Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell would be first and foremost. Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. I would start there. I'm assuming you're a fan of YouTube. I would watch Milton Friedman's Free to Choose. And I'm not saying all these guys were correct about everything, but conceptually, I think they make a lot of sense. And I mean, how can you go wrong with Friedman, Sowell, and Henry Hazlitt? I'd start there. All right. I think that does that. Sebastian, can you throw up the next super chat? AJ, thank you very much. What do you think of the IBC? Thanks for sharing your perspective on it. Okay. Thank you for sharing your perspective on macro. It helps my family financial operations big time. I haven't really researched it much. I know Bob Murphy does a lot of homework on that. That's probably where I'd refer you. I'd go to Bob Murphy's podcast. He's an Austrian economist. He does another podcast called Contra Krugman, which is fantastic, with a guy named Tom Woods. But Bob Murphy has his own podcast where he's addressed this several times. And so I really trust him because he's a really knowledgeable guy. He knows what he's talking about. He comes from the Austrian side of things. And not that they're perfect either, but I know I've listened to a lot of Bob's stuff, and he really knows what he's talking about. So I would probably refer you there. Okay, Sebastian, do we have any more super chats? Alex, thank you for the super sticker. Okay, cool. Thank you, Alex. Joseph, thank you for the super chat. Looking at the Dragon portfolio or investing. How do you invest in physical gold if you're in a 403B? Joseph, I don't know what a 403B is. I'm assuming that's some sort of tax-deferred investment vehicle. Boy, the thing that's hard, Joseph, is I haven't been an employee for almost 20 years. And I never had a 401k. I've never had an IRA. I've never had any of these things. I've always just had businesses. So it's hard for me to give you suggestions on things that I don't have any personal experience with. But I would assume this is like a 401k. So, and I would assume that it's something where you're going to be penalized for investing in physical gold. From a tax standpoint. So obviously there's pros and cons as far as how much confidence you have in the system or lack of confidence you have in the system. But if you've got, if you're not too worried that you're not one of the people that really is adamant about owning physical gold, I am. But if you're not one of those people, then you could look at something like Sprott's product, where you can, I would suggest Sprott over the GLD, because their counterparty, I think, is a little more secure. With the GLD, you've got HSBC. We all know why it might be bad to do business with HSBC. But the Sprott product, their counterparty or custodian is the Canadian Mint. So I'd prefer to do business with the Canadian Mint than HSBCs. So, but that said, I've only researched it for 3 or 4 hours. So I would do the homework yourself. But if you just absolutely cannot invest in physical gold because the downside of maybe a tax hit or something, I would look at one of those products that had that owned the physical asset. You don't want to have a product like USO where they just try to match the price of the asset through the futures market, because then you're dealing with contango, and you don't want to deal with that. You just want something that owns the underlying asset. But of course, physical gold is preferable. Okay, Sebastian, do we have another super chat? Okay. Wally, thank you. Should oil go negative again on Tuesday? And if the problem continues every month, how do you see it affecting the grand scheme of things? I don't know if it really affects the grand scheme of things too much. It obviously affects the traders. It affects a lot of people that are in the financial economy, but it doesn't really affect too much of the real economy. I mean, I don't know if you saw my interview with Jim Rogers, but I brought up the negative $40 oil. And he pointed out very quickly, well, yeah, it's negative 40 on the futures market, but you can't go down to your local gas station and they're not going to pay you to take gas, right? It's still $20 a barrel. So, or whatever it was at the time. It's just really this weird storage issue that we have in the United States. I would probably, instead of looking at oil as kind of a monolith, I would segment it into West Texas and Brent, and I would pay more attention to Brent, because according to my limited understanding, Brent isn't really subject to the anomalies that we had here in the United States because of the storage issues. That said, Wally, make sure that you're tuning in to the George Gammon channel next week, because I interviewed Art Berman, who, if you're a fan of Macro Voices, you know exactly who Art Berman is. But he is the top, or one of the top experts in oil in the entire world. And he's been doing this a lot, I mean, decades. He is a pro. So I get his opinion on everything that's been going on in the oil markets, the history of oil going back to World War I, and then what we can expect from oil and the price of oil and how it plays into the economy over the next 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years plus. So you're going to love that one. All right, Sebastian, we got the next. Andrew, thank you for the super chat. Have an opportunity zone fund. Need to invest in the U.S. What do you think of targeting single-family homes with significant land that might be valuable for agriculture, harvesting natural resources? Andrew, it's all a function of price. I mean, if you can get something for under the cost of, like, way under the cost of construction, and you don't need liquidity, or you don't need a lot of liquidity, then I think it could be interesting. But you're taking a little bit of a gamble there, in the sense that if you go buy all these homes that are kind of out in the rural areas, and if if that macro play doesn't pan out, then you're stuck with an asset that's very illiquid. I'm not saying that it won't work out that way. I do see people kind of moving more out to the rural areas, but I don't know if it would be a significant enough of a move to warrant this as a main strategy for your fund. And the reason I say that is because I go back to the 1920s. And if you go back, the Spanish flu in 1918 wiped out 50 million people. 50 million. I mean, that is crazy. Now, obviously, hopefully, we won't get anywhere near that with the cerveza sickness. But then you look at how that changed behavior throughout the 1920s. Really didn't. That said, people couldn't work online back then. You couldn't just work from your laptop or from your desktop at home. I understand that. But and of course the economy was much more industrial, which required more physical labor. But still, my point is that I don't know that it had a massive shift in the behavior of society, meaning the Spanish flu. So I think it seems so impactful right now because we're living it. But will it be this big of a deal in 5 years? I don't know. I hope not. I hope not. But so I think it's an interesting play, but I don't know that I'd go all in on it, if that makes sense. If liquidity is your priority, and I don't, maybe that isn't an issue for you or your fund, but that would be my take on it. All right, Sebastian, we got another super chat. AJ, thank you for the super chat. Looks like you're right there with my sister and my nieces. I live in Dallas and own 6 paid off rental units. All right, man. Congratulations. Congratulations. Should I sell and invest elsewhere, such as foreign equities or gold stocks? This is really tough, AJ, because I don't know your personal situation. I don't know your priorities. I don't know your family situation. I don't know your balance sheet. I don't know your P&L, your personal P&L. Gold stock. I'm assuming you don't have any liquidity, or you don't have any cash. You don't have any dry powder, AJ. I would not sell them because, I mean, I think Texas is going to be the beneficiary of taxes going to infinity and beyond in the Northeast, California, places like that. Although I know that Texas has their issues and they may raise property taxes, but still, I mean, I don't like any taxes, but I like property taxes a little better than income because you have a choice there, right? Income, it's kind of, you're stuck. So, but with these rental, I mean, you could get squeezed a little bit. I don't know. I think the macro environment for Texas is pretty darn good. They're obviously all cash flow positive. I mean, I don't know what your return is. You might be able to get a little bit better return elsewhere, but I don't know. I definitely wouldn't sell them all. No way. I'd probably just say, okay, how much dry powder do I want? And I'd go to the bank and I'd take out a line of credit. And then if you took and used that line of credit for something you wanted to invest in long term, then I would roll that line of credit over into a fixed rate 30-year mortgage if I could. So as an example, let's say you've got $1 million worth of rental units and you go to the bank and you look at your portfolio, and I suggest 10% gold, let's say. And I know you're talking about gold stocks, but I'm just using this as an example. Then I might say, okay, maybe you take out a line of credit for 100,000 and you buy so I don't know if you want to buy all of it, but maybe 75. I wouldn't buy all at one time, but maybe 50, 75, something like that, with buy physical gold. Maybe you look at your portfolio and say, okay, I'd like to have 2% of my portfolio in gold stocks. All right, well then take that line of credit and then take $20,000 of that line of credit and spend it on gold stocks. Now, again, I wouldn't buy anything that you don't want to hold for 10 years plus. So like Jim Rogers says, let's just say that you've got 20 investments. You only have 20 investments or speculations in your entire life. That's how you should invest, or that's how you should speculate. And I agree. So I'm assuming this gold stock trade would be, or purchase would be something that would be one of those 20s. You're adamant about it, but you still don't, 2% of your portfolio maybe, because this is the speculative side of your portfolio with gold stocks. And I know I'm bouncing around here a bit. I apologize. I'm going from the insurance side of your portfolio to the speculative side of your portfolio and back all over the place. But I'm trying to answer your question directly now. And then once you buy the 20,000 worth of gold stocks, let's say, I would just try to term it out. So because you don't want to be subject to that interest rate and you want to short the dollar. So I would try to take that 20,000, go back to another bank or the same bank and say, okay, I want to make this a permanent loan. I want to make this a 30-year fixed rate loan. And most likely that they can do that for you, because they'll just sell the paper to Fannie and Freddie, especially if it's a big bank. And that's probably how I'd suggest doing it. But again, that's if it were me. I don't know the situation with your family. I don't know if you've got kids. I don't know your personal balance sheet. I don't know if you've got more than that. I don't know if you've already got dry powder. I don't know the P&L. So assuming this is your entire net worth, and it were me with no kids and no wife, that's kind of how I'd think through it. All right, Sebastian, we ready, buddy? Free thinker, thank you for the super chat. This is the difference between inflationist and deflationist, mainly on how extreme the Fed will go. And if the average Joe starts to fear, yeah, you got it. That's a real basic way to sum it up. It's just really well, let me be clear. The difference between the super well-researched and smart inflationists and deflationists, that's really that's the line in the sand. It's just, is the Fed going to go far enough to create helicopter money? And then how much helicopter money will they create? So the deflationist would say the Fed's not going to do that. And because they're not going to create, or they're not going to have the ability to create helicopter money, maybe the government will, but they think they're going to be limited there as to what they can do and how they can inject that money into the system. Therefore, we'll see deflation. The inflationists say, okay, yeah, I get that, but the Fed's going to stop at nothing, and the government is going to stop at nothing, especially when they look at the Japan and the deflation there. They're going to stop at nothing to get as much money in the real economy as necessary to create velocity, increase inflation to wipe away the debt. So that's the argument. And yes, it goes back to the average Joe fearing inflation, because a lot of inflation is psychological. And I talked about this briefly with Hugh Hendry, and it's not just psychological from the standpoint of the consumer, but also the banks that create money and how aggressive they're getting. And there's a lot of cross currents there. But the main takeaway is that, and that's the way I see the argument as well. It's how far do you think the Fed's going to go? How far do you think the government is going to go? And then how does that change psychology? I think you're looking at it the perfect way. All right, Sebastian, we got another super chat, buddy. Okay, T-Mac, thank you for the super chat. If you were 64, secure in retirement with pension, Social Security, what would you do with $1 million that you had parked in deferred tax IRA in cash? First of all, I would, if it were me, T-Mac, I would not be in the United States. I can tell you that for sure. I would, as soon as we get the cerveza sickness in the rearview mirror, I would take the opportunity to do some traveling. I'd go to Southeastern Europe. I'd go to South America. I'd come down, check out Medellin, because your Social Security and your pension, it's just going to go so much further. I mean, I really can't articulate how well you could live in Medellin, as an example, with like $3,000 a month US. I mean, you'd have a maid. You wouldn't do any of your cooking and cleaning. You'd be able to go out to dinner every single night. I mean, you could live almost not in any building, but in any area you wanted to live. You could live in the fanciest parts of town. Your quality of life and your purchasing power would be on a level that I don't think most Americans really understand. And I'm assuming you don't have any kids in the house, or maybe you've got a wife you might have to convince, or a husband. I don't know if you're a guy or girl, but I'd, if it were me, I would consider that. And then as far as the 1 million, boy, I don't know what the flexibilities are there for an IRA. I'm assuming you could do like a self-directed thing where I would try to get some physical gold at 10%, especially with 1 million, man. I'd try to have 100,000 in physical. And if you couldn't do the physical, I'd try to do at least 50 or 75 in Rick's product that would the Sprott product, the PHYS, that would that where the underlying asset is physical. I would probably shop around. I just do a little snooping with real estate and linear markets to try to bring in some more dollar denominated cash flow. If you liked one of the other, well, no, I don't think you could do that with your tax-deferred IRA. If it was self-directed, I know you can do real estate. But I'm not saying that I'd buy now. Please don't get me wrong. I would start just snooping around and start seeing what the prices are, doing comps, start educating yourself, know what a good deal is, what a cheap cash flow. I just start doing the homework, and then maybe you find a great deal, fantastic, pull the trigger. But you wait a year, you wait 2 years, 6 months, see how things play out. And then if you can get a smoking deal, then try to lock in some fixed rate debt to pull the trigger. I'm assuming you can do that with a self-directed IRA. You might not be able to, because again, IRAs, I have no experience with them, or 401ks. So kind of make sure that you take that into when I'm giving you advice on this, make sure you take that into consideration, that I know almost nothing about IRAs. And then I'd keep some dry powder, to your point, but I would be a little worried to have $1 million worth of dry powder with no exposure to gold whatsoever. Because yes, you're going to do great if we go through an asset deflation, but if you go through a consumer price inflation at the same time, then you're losing purchasing power for the currency that your bills are denominated in, although you're gaining purchasing power for the assets, but your monthly bills aren't connected to the price of Apple or corporate debt or something like that, or even housing. So I'd want a little gold in there just as a nice hedge against not only inflation, but or consumer price inflation, let me be clear, but also just the insanity of the world. That's probably where I would go. And then, I also keep some dry powder, because in the next 6 months or so, we could get some really good deals on maybe commodities or oil or something. But there again, you'd have to really do a lot of homework in order to pull the trigger there. So I think that's how I'd be looking at it. I'd have a little gold, and then I'd sit tight on the rest and just try to educate myself on real estate. And then if I see something that's super cheap, not only in real estate, but on the stock side of the equation, let's say that the Dow goes down by 50% from here, down to call it 12,000. Well, then there might be some good deals where you'd want to take some of your dry powder and you'd want to take action. So that's kind of how I'd look at it. All right, Sebastian, we got another super chat, buddy. Gary, thank you for the super chat. Hi, George was thinking of taking 20,000 pounds, okay, loan to stack a little more gold and silver. No, because you can't get a yield. You got a negative carry on that. So if gold doesn't go up, then you're high and dry. And then another thing that I don't think most people think about, Gary, is let's just say that your gold goes to, I'm not sure what the pound price is, but let's say that it goes to 10,000 pounds per ounce, the gold. Okay, fantastic. And let's say you buy at 2,000. So you've got an $8,000 capital gain. You may be saying to yourself, okay, well, that's great news. Awesome. I'll take that all day long. Right. But let's just assume that the price of gold going from 2,000 up to 10,000 went up just with the rate of inflation. So your gold has no more purchasing power. None. At 2,000 at 10,000 than it did at 2,000. The problem is if you sell your gold to try to use some of that purchasing power, you've got to pay, call it 30, or well, let's call it 20% in tax. So you're losing purchasing power. So just because gold goes to 10,000 or 20,000 doesn't necessarily mean that you increase your purchasing power. You could lose because of taxes when you have to sell. So think about that. What if you took out a 5-year loan? You had to pay a 3% rate of interest. And I'm guessing it might be fixed, but let's just assume that it's fixed. We'll give you the benefit of the doubt. And so you're having to pay the interest. And let's just say that your gold within that 5-year period doubles in price. But again, it just goes up with inflation. You're not only losing purchasing power because of the taxes, but then you're also losing more purchasing power because you got to pay the interest rate on the loan, right? It's too speculative. The only way you can make money is if the price of gold goes up a lot more than your interest rate in real terms. And I don't know. I mean, it probably will. I mean, I'm a huge fan of gold. You guys all know that. But I'm a fan of gold to keep you rich. I'm not a fan of gold really to make you rich. And that's a big difference, right? I think gold miners make you rich. Silver miners make you rich. Silver, maybe. But gold, I just don't know. It can. It very well could. But I wouldn't. I really wouldn't look at it that way. So I think that's the best way I can answer that question. All right, Sebastian, we got another one, buddy. Free Thinker, thank you for the super chat. Is the difference between we already answered this, Sebastian. Revival 305, thank you for the super chat. Sitting on cash now. I eventually want to buy real estate to live in when the market goes down in 2 years. Okay, with negative, yeah. Would you sit on cash in the 2 years? What would you do with it? Well, first thing, Revival, is I wouldn't hold your breath on getting a loan, a mortgage with negative interest rates. That I'm not going to say it's not going to happen, but I put the probability as like just almost zero, 1%. So then your rebuttal may be, yeah, but George, there's negative interest rate mortgages in Denmark, so they're going to be here in the United States. Right. But what you're not seeing with those negative interest rate mortgages is the bank really isn't paying you to borrow money when you tack on all their fees, all their loan documents, all the transaction, all the nickel and diming you to death. The bank isn't going to pay you to take money. That ain't going to happen. So now, although the interest rate may be negative and you may be paying back less than you borrow, when you add up all of the fees and everything the bank is going to charge you, you're still paying. You're still paying the bank. So I don't. I would be very leery, even if rates go negative on Fed funds. I wouldn't assume that, and I definitely wouldn't set up my portfolio to assume that I was going to get a negative rate mortgage. Or that even if you do get a negative rate mortgage, that it's not going to cost you more money than you're borrowing. As far as the other part of your question, I wouldn't really sit on cash. I'd probably have it in T-bills, rolling it over, especially if it has a significant amount of cash. I guess that really depends on how much you have, and if it's over 250 grand, because then the FDIC kicks in. And I'm not a fan of the FDIC. They're wildly underfunded, but I do think they'd get a bailout, and I know it is a little cumbersome. Yeah, maybe I'd still rather be in T-bills and roll them over, just maybe 3-month T-bills or something. Let's see. And I need to be clear, because whenever I say T-bills, people freak out. They say, I'm not giving my money to the government. That's crazy, George. Watch all your videos. You're contradicting yourself. Why would you give money to the government when they're over indebted and they've got these deficits? And that's why would you do that? That's crazy. Listen, I'm not saying buy a 30-year treasury. I'm saying buy a 3-month. There's a big difference there. In 3 months, you're going to not only get your principal back, but you might get a little bit of interest. But you know that you don't have much inflation risk in 3 months. In a year, 2 years, 10 years, 30 years, you've got a lot of inflation risk. So there's a big difference there. And you can even go lower than 3 months. That's not the lowest term that you could roll, or just a little more cumbersome to keep rolling it over every single, call it month or something like that. Then if you really need the money for a down payment, I don't know if I would go into anything else, because then you're risking a loss. And I don't know that I would really, how can I say this? I don't know that I would just be ignorant of the market right now. Meaning I wouldn't just, I'm not even going to look at the real estate market. I'm not going to look at real estate right now, because I'm going to put my feet, I'm going to hold my ground, and I'm definitely not going to buy anything for 2 years, because I know in 2 years the market's going to be down by 50% and I'm going to look like a genius. I would hesitate there, because yes, the market can go down, but it could go down just in real terms. Nominal, it might not go down. And if we go through a typical cycle, it would take more than 2 years, really. Now the prices may go down slightly, but it'd be tough to have a bottom in 2 years, although it's not impossible. So my point here is I would start educating myself on the market, the comps, and what prices are right now. And I'd start looking. And I'm not saying go out and buy right now. I'm saying look, because you never know when you can find a super motivated seller that could sell you their property at the same price as you're trying to get it in 2 years. Or maybe the same price, that you could have bought it in 2012, which would be, you see what I'm saying? The market, because real estate is so inefficient, it's not like the price of gold where it is what it is, or the price of a stock that's got a lot of liquidity. It's just, there's a 1 penny spread and that's it, right? On real estate, there can be $100,000 spread based on how desperate someone is to sell and how much they like you. So, I mean, just as a guy who's made a lot of money in real estate, you make money on the buy side. And as an example, here in Medellin, I've purchased properties for literally half of what they would sell on the retail market. Half, 50%. So, and it's just because, number one, they were desperate. They had to sell within a couple days, and they couldn't wait 6 weeks. They couldn't wait 6 months to sell. I happened to be right there with cash in my pocket. I knew how to negotiate a deal, and it's the way you set it up. So that's why I say, yes, be patient, but also make sure that you're looking for deals if you're committed to buying a piece of property, whether it's for your family or for an investment. I think that's the best advice I can give you. All right, Sebastian, we got another super chat, buddy. Andre, thank you for the super chat. If QE didn't reach the real economy in Japan after 3 decades, what would cause it to leak into the U.S. real economy? If cash won't be trash, why not just buy USD in large cap stocks and dump gold? Well, first of all, Andre, you're making a lot of assumptions, buddy. But also, let's just say that what you're saying is true, and that the QE in the United States never produces inflation, and we go down the path of Japan. All right. Well, Japanese stocks are down 80% from their highs, 80. And that's not let me be clear, guys. That's not an exact number, but they're down huge, let's say, 30 years later. So do you want to buy large caps at when the peak in the market was 30,000? We're at, I don't know where we are now. Maybe, where are we? I didn't pay much attention to that last week, so I was busy with other things. Let me pull it up here. So we're at 26 or 23.6. So if the market is, if we're using Japan as an example, if the market could go down to 10,000 over the next 30 years, the Dow, do you want to hold large cap stocks? Whew, I don't. I don't. Maybe you want to hold some USD, some dry powder, but I don't know if I'd want to hold large caps at these valuations. Now, if the valuations get down below 10, PEs, then maybe you've got an argument there. You might want to come in and buy and have some dry powder. But also, you're assuming that the U.S. will be Japan. And what if it's not? Then if you dump all your gold and you're just holding on to nothing but USD, you're going to get smoked. You're going to get absolutely crushed. And so I don't know if that's, I think it's a gamble, really. I don't know why you wouldn't take a more diversified approach and have some dry powder just in case asset prices go down, or we have a debt deflation, or maybe even a CPI deflation, although I don't know that that's likely, but maybe you have an asset deflation. And then, but then keep some gold there, because honestly, in a deflation type situation, your gold may do very well, because if you're going to think about what that looks like, think about what deflation in the United States looks like when the government has 24 trillion in debt, right? So people often just look at deflation in this broad stroke, and they really don't think about the nuance. The reason deflation and inflation matters to the government is because of tax receipts, right? That's why. The reason the government wants inflation, and we always say it inflates away the debt. Well, how does it inflate away the debt? Because they get more tax receipts if we have inflation. That's it, right? It's just tax receipts. So if the government is getting less and less tax receipts and their deficit is increasing, or they had to spend less, which I doubt they ever would, but what does that look like for the United States? What does that look like for the economy? What does that look like for the average American? That would be, you're looking at some serious social unrest. You're looking at the quality of life in the United States not only going down, but markets being incredibly volatile. So what would most likely do well in that situation as well? Gold. So and also too, let's say you have deflation throughout history. Well, it's because the gold, a lot of reasons for that. But my point is that let's just say that we have deflation. It's most likely that although the price of gold may go down, it's going to go down a lot less than the price of everything else. So I would be very hesitant with this type of portfolio. Then I would add to that let's remember, any of these central banks or governments, if they absolutely had to, and if they could, if they were just like a dictator, let's say, they could create inflation, right? Let's not fool ourselves. If the central bank, if the Fed just had a way to deposit $1 million in every American's bank account, we would have inflation. I don't care what happened in Japan. I don't care what happened in the 1930s. It doesn't matter. You would see massive inflation in the CPI. So they always can do it if they have the political willpower and they want to ignore enough laws. But let's just, it's physically possible, I think, is my point, right? So I just, especially when you've got governments and central banks that are so hyper-phobic of deflation, man, I don't know if I'd want to take that bet, especially not go all in on it. I think that's my point. All right, ready for the next question. Millennial Cap, thank you for the super chat. Assuming you recently acquired a large sum of inheritance, okay? How would you invest to protect your future from future turbulence? Maybe gold, value stocks. Appreciate your show. Really helps average investor. Okay, so if I was in your position, Millennial Cap, I would first and foremost do an audit of my monthly expenses. I like QuickBooks. I've been an entrepreneur for decades, so QuickBooks was always my go-to. And even for my personal expenditures, I still use QuickBooks. So, but whatever your favorite accounting software is, maybe there's some new form of QuickBooks that I don't know about that's even better, but it doesn't matter. In whatever your accounting software is, make sure that if you're not keeping track of your expenses with your bank account and having to reconcile your banking account within that accounting software at the end of every month, make sure you start doing that right now. Because you could say I could ask you, Millennial Cap, how much money do you spend a month? You say, I don't know, maybe $3,000, $5,000, something. But you really don't know until you get every single transaction from your bank statement into QuickBooks and then reconcile to make sure that every single penny is accounted for and it's in a chart of accounts on your P&L, so you can see exactly where that money's going and you know whether it's a recurring cost, expense, or a non-recurring cost or expense. So do that first and foremost. And then once you have a number there after, let's say, 2 or 3 months, as to what your average is, let's just say that it's $4,000. The very first thing that I would do is try to say, okay, how can I invest my money at the very minimum to get $4,000 a month? because if you're able to do that, then you don't have to dip into your savings or your inheritance for your living expenses. And then you know, so it never draws down, right? It may draw down on paper. Like, let's say you bought a bunch of real estate. Okay. Yeah. Let's say it goes down by 50%. Okay. Well, yes, you took a loss on paper, but it really doesn't matter too much because you still have that $4,000 a month coming in income, assuming that you still had renters. And I know that's a kind of an unknown as well, but let's just assume that you still had your renters in place. So that's what I do first. Now, I'm not saying that once you established your number, let's say it's $4,000 a month, that you run right out and buy real estate with it. That's not what I'm saying, especially in this environment. I'm saying that now you have a goal. Your goal is to produce that much income. Then what you do is you've got to think through the way you structure a portfolio. So I can't give you any specific investment advice. I can just tell you what I would do. And I would look at, and I'd say, okay, 10% insurance. That means physical gold. 10% speculation, meaning the only reason I'm buying XYZ is because I think it's cheap and the price is going to go up. Key being cheap. So that doesn't mean that you go out and buy Netflix. Okay, or Uber or Facebook or whatever. It's got to be cheap. Netflix isn't cheap on any metric, right? So then I would look at the 80% of your portfolio and say, how can I invest it to make sure that I'm getting that $4,000 a month? Because by my definition of investment, which I allocate 80% of my portfolio, it has to pay me to own it. So that would be rental properties, that would be dividend paying stocks, that could be bonds. I like well, right now with the US bonds, you're not getting paid anything, but it could be other bonds and denominated in other currencies as an example. But I'd start there. So then I'd say, okay, well, how do I invest this to get the $4,000, making sure that I prioritize the word cheap. And I completely ignore whether or not I think the price of XYZ asset is going up or down. Ignore that. Don't even, just try to get it out of your mind. And then just ask yourself, okay, if I'm buying this dividend paying stock, is it cheap? Look back through history, look at the PEs, look at the CAPE ratio, look at the overall broad market, look at the individual stock, look at it. If it's a commodity, maybe it's an oil producer, something like that. Just do the analysis, do the homework, and ask yourself if it's cheap. And then if that cash flow is a good deal. And then if it is, go ahead and buy it, but then keep some dry powder. You know, you always want to have some dry powder, if possible, if you can make your nut with that. And that's how I'd look at it. And with real estate, same way. I would start looking, but I wouldn't pull the trigger right away. I would only see if I could find a really good deal based on historic prices adjusted for inflation and considering the positive cash flow, and then considering the price of the debt. And I don't even know if you'd want to take on any debt. If you do, make sure it's fixed rate 30-year. Another thing, I'm assuming you're a millennial, that I would do instantly, and this is something I would do. I would buy a triplex, and I'd live in one unit of the triplex, assuming you're not in like California. I'm just going to assume that you're in a linear market where you can get a triplex, or even if you're in California, if you could get a triplex that was cash flow positive, that threw off a good amount of cash flow, and then just have your tenants pay your mortgage while you don't have a cost of putting a roof over your head. And as you get older, you'll see And notice that that's your number one expense, is putting a roof over your head, whether it's rent or your mortgage payment. So if you can eliminate that from the equation, that's just more money that you're going to be able to allocate to investing moving forward. And so let's, as an example, let's say, and I'm assuming you're not even going to work. Maybe obviously you'd probably want to work somewhere. You wouldn't want to be a loser like me and retire at 38. But assuming that you didn't even have a gig, if your net was $4,000 a month and you didn't have any overhead for housing, well, now all of a sudden your net's only $2,000 a month, let's just say, and you could take that additional $2,000 and invest it. And then you're going to be, if you can pull that off, once you're in your late 40s, 50s, you're going to be all set. You're not going to have to worry about money too much. All right, next question. Ike, thank you for the super chat. When infinite QE crashes the dollar, what will happen to the won? Won't emerging markets and Eurozone be worse off after the dollar crash? Grant Williams' inevitable gold standard to stabilize prices is correct. Yeah, well, I think Grant Williams is listen to Grant Williams. I think that's he's awesome. I mean, he is really, really awesome. Not only that, he's a great guy too. I've gone back and forth with email with him for our interview, and he's really a nice dude. But he's smart. He's just wicked smart, and I think he sees things very, very clearly. As far as you're talking about all currencies going down just faster than the United States, I don't know about that, because you've got to look at the growth of the M2 money supply first and foremost, compared to other countries like Japan and like Europe or the ECB. And the Fed's balance sheet is grown much faster. Our M2 money supply has grown much faster. So not only that, but we have a lot of dollars outside of the United States. And Jeff Snyder would argue we have more dollars outside of the United States than we have inside of the United States. So let's just say that Grant is right and we need a gold standard. But let's say in the process, these foreign entities, whether they're corporations, countries, decide, hey, you know what, this dollar thing really not working out for me. So we gradually go off of a dollar. The dollar is the global reserve currency. I know it's not going to happen overnight. And I know that people are going to say, George, but Brent Johnson and Jeff Snyder and Lacey Hunt and all these really smart guys, they see the dollar going up. Yeah, I understand that. I'm talking about over the next 5 years, 10 years, gradually kind of, even if the dollar does go up to, let's say, 140, you don't think that other countries are going to look at that and say, okay, it's now more than ever, we need to abandon the dollar. And so, or let's just say that the dollar went to 140 on the DXY and we had a Plaza Accord 2.0, right? Where artificially it came down back down to like 100 or 90, something like that. Well, you don't think that other countries are going to learn from that and be like, okay, maybe we can't do it right now, but we need to have a game plan for over the next 10 years, the next 20 years, to really get rid or to wean ourselves from this dollar reserve currency or being so dependent upon dollars. And if that happens, then and it might not happen overnight, but through the course of time, you have more and more dollars flood into the United States to create the type of inflation that like Schiff and other guys talk about so often. And that really couldn't happen to the same extent with what will happen to the won? I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about the yen. I apologize. But on my point there, you see what I'm saying. With the yen, it's not the global reserve currency. So there's not these trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars worth of yen outside of Japan. There's a lot, But when you compare it to the ratio of how much is inside of Japan and how much is outside, there's going to be less yen outside of Japan, where the United States, it's the opposite. So that's why I think the dollar could go down faster than these other fiat currencies, although they're all going down relative to gold and silver, right? Now, let me go back to your specific question that I misread. I apologize. What would happen to the won? I don't know if I can answer that question, Ike, because there's so many variables you have there. The difference between the yen and the won, of course, is the won is pegged to the dollar. The yen is free floating. So how, if we go through infinity or QE infinity, it depends on the inflation. It depends on interest rates. It depends on the trade deficit the United States has with China and their ability to get dollars they need to keep the peg. There's just, I don't know if I can answer that question. Anything I could give you would be a total speculation based on about 45,000 cross currents that I'm not smart enough to figure out. So a hell of a question, though, that's for sure. But I think the main takeaway would be what I was saying initially about the dollar and other fiat currencies, and then making sure that you're listening to Grant Williams stuff for sure. All right, next question. Daniel, thank you for the super chat. Hey, George, what sort of advice would you give someone in their 20s with a decent career engineer but tons of student debt? Also, you should go on the Tom Woods show. I'd love to go on the Tom Woods show. I've been listening to the Tom Woods show since he started. In fact, I used to listen to Tom Woods when he would fill in for Peter Schiff on Schiff's radio show. Remember when Schiff was doing it daily? And Stefan Molyneux, I know, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. Stefan Molyneux, I think is the way you pronounce it. You remember when he would fill in for Schiff occasionally as well? But Tom Woods, that's when I first started listening to Tom Woods. So when Tom started his podcast, I was all about it. I was listening to it nonstop. And I like Tom Woods. I think he's a really good dude. I have a tremendous amount of respect for him. He's just a super, super smart guy, obviously in the libertarian Austrian camp. So I kind of lean that way myself. So I'd love to go on the Tom Woods show. I'd love to interview Tom Woods. So if any of you guys know him, make sure that you let him know that I'd love to have him on to promote his podcast, whether it's the Tom Woods show or Contra Krugman or anything else he does with the Mises Institute, Lou Rockwell, any of those guys. I'd love to have him on. Okay, going back to your original question, though, Daniel, I think it would be very similar to the advice that I just gave Millennial Cap, in that I would look for a way to get into a fourplex or a triplex, or any way that you could house hack. So, and again, obviously it has to be cash flow positive. I'm not saying go into a triplex if you've got a negative carry. If you, and hopefully you live in a place like Kansas City or kind of a linear market, and it would be even better because then you're taking there's a lot less downside, I think. But you want to try to find a triplex, live in it, rent out the other 2 units. Your tenants pay your mortgage for you, and they pay the property taxes. They pay everything because you're cash flow positive. And then whatever money you would have allocated to a mortgage payment or your rent that you're paying right now, you take that money and you start a savings fund. You get your, I hate to call it a rainy day fund because you guys know I'm not a real big fan of Dave Ramsey, but fine. You call it a rainy day fund. And then once you get that, then you start investing the money that you're saving. And if you can just invest the money you would have spent on rent or to put a roof over your head, and you do it wisely, how we talk about on this show or on my channel, once you get into your late 40s, like me, I'm 47, you're gonna, you're going to be doing all right if you do it well. You're going to be financially. I think you're who is it? There's one guy. I think, is it Miles Beckler? I don't know. One of the online marketing guys that I watch often. I think it might have been Miles. He's got a quote in his office that says, "Do something today your future self will thank you for." And I think that's extremely powerful. And I don't think there's anything you can do right now, Daniel, that your 45-year-old self will thank you for more than house hacking and taking the money you would have spent on housing and investing it wisely. All right, that's the best advice I can give you. And if you know Tom Woods, tell him I'd love to interview him for the Rebel Capitalist show. I'd love to go on his show, of course. All right, next question. Mr. And by the way, Sebastian, we need to, I don't know how many more super chats we have, but let's stop the super chats, guys, so I can make sure that I can get to lunch and get everything I need done for the day. Mr. Scott, do you even merch, bro? Or do I have merchandise? No. Where can I get a Rebel Capitalist t-shirt or hat and a George Gammon bobblehead coffee mug? Yeah, I could be like Dwight Schrute. Remember Dwight? I love that show. I love his character so much. Remember he had his own the Dwight Schrute bobblehead right there on his desk. Maybe I could get one of those. Yeah, maybe. I haven't had time to do that. I don't. You can't really make any money on or any significant money, I don't think. But I do think it's a great idea to build community. And obviously that's something I'm all about. That's why I use a lot of the same words. And that's why I know, what's funny is when I do a video, at least once or twice in the comments, when I read through them, there'll be a person saying, "Stop yelling, stop saying step number 2 so loud. You're waking up everyone in my family." They're like, "Damn it. Can't you just do a video at a normal volume?" And of course I could, but what I do, one of the main reasons is, number one, I've got to try to keep your attention for 20 minutes. And that's not tough. That's not easy to do. So that you got to have a lot of energy to do that. If I was just boring and mundane like Ben Stein or something, no one would ever watch the videos. They'd be too boring. So that's why you got to keep the energy up. And that's why I try to do that. Although that's kind of my personality as well, as you guys know from these live streams. But also because you turn it into something that's fun for the whole community. So I'll have a comment in there saying, "Stop yelling." But then I'll also have I'll have 50 comments saying, step number 2, but they'll spell 2 like TTTT WWW. Yeah, so I know some people got to get a kick out of it. So that's why I would sell merch in the future, not really to monetize, because I don't think you make much money, but just to build community, and I think that would be fun. So we'll probably do it, but not in the next 6 months. But I would say maybe in the next 12 months, that's something that could be realistic for sure. Okay, next question. Muad, thank you for the super chat. If interest rates go to 0 and below, wouldn't the banks be adverse to lending? Will a Joe Schmo like me even be able to get a mortgage and investment properties? You're hitting the nail on the head, Muad, in that it distorts things dramatically. Now, the Fed's model, or what a Fed person would say, or your friend and family member Fred, what they would say is, well, you just don't understand, because it's going to promote lending, because the Fed is going to charge the banks for their excess reserves, or their reserves that they have, the bank reserves that they have held with the Fed. They're going to charge them for that. So even if mortgage rates, let's say, are negative, let's say the Fed is charging them -2%. And if they can lend out the money at -1%, it's costing them less. So I guess you could say it's kind of a net benefit that way. But to your point, it really gums up the system, and it's not going to be as fluid. And what we can see in Japan and in Europe is that it doesn't work. It doesn't increase lending. If anything, it decreases it. And it just creates a massive, epic amounts of malinvestment, unintended consequences, a misallocation of resources, and it creates deflation, if anything, because there's less money that's actually getting out into the system. So I don't know that it'll prevent you from getting a mortgage for investment properties, but it's definitely it'll definitely be, in my opinion, if you look at Japan, it'll be adverse to lending. It'll be adverse to the whole system, and over the long run, if they keep it up, it just makes retail banks go bust. I mean, the retail banking can't survive on that. So let's see here. As far as, I don't know that it would prevent you from getting a mortgage, though. So I wouldn't be overly concerned with that. But if I did have investment properties right now, I'd want to get them onto a 30-year fixed rate loan because it's cheap. And let's say you can get it at 3.5%. And let's say in 5 or 3 years, because of negative interest rates, you could get it at 2% or 1%. Okay. I mean, yeah, that would be better, but I don't know that it's worth the risk of interest rates going back up. If you can, again, because it goes back to the mentality. It goes back to trying to figure out if prices or interest rates are going up or down compared to just asking yourself, is the debt right now cheap? And you just can't argue that debt right now, 30-year fixed rate mortgages aren't cheap. So I think that's how I'd answer that question. I would definitely be worried about the adverse, the system being gummed up and it affecting lending adversely. But I don't know I'd take it to the extent of losing sleep over it. And that said, I'd try to lock in the mortgages now on your existing properties. All right, next question. SN, thank you for the super chat. Druckenmiller observes that QE is bearish for bonds. But Bianco noted QE infinity in April is what's keeping rates down at 60 basis points. Yeah, you saw that. That was really good, wasn't it? Yeah, I really like Jim's presentation. Your take. Fed is, excuse me, Fed is slowing QE into May, June, bullish for bonds. I'm not sure that it would be bullish for bonds because I don't know how much of a causal effect there is. It's just because people are seeing the increase in QE as inflationary. So I think the causal component there is the market psychology and the market seeing more or potentially more inflation in the pipeline, shooting rates up. I don't know that it's directly correlated to QE. If anything, QE creates more demand. So what Druckenmiller is talking about most likely is every time the Fed does quantitative easing, it's bearish for bonds, meaning interest rates go up, which is completely counterintuitive because you would think that interest rates would go down because the Fed is creating more demand, or prices would go up for the bonds because the Fed is creating more demand. But it's not what we've seen. Now, going over to Bianco and how you reconcile the two thoughts there is Bianco, go back and listen to his presentation. He didn't say that that QE, I'm sorry. Yes, see, so let me think this through. So QE was keeping rates down at 60%. Yeah. So I think that's the difference of opinion there. So Druckenmiller is looking at the charts of QE in the past, showing that it's actually pushed bond rates up, meaning prices down. and assuming that plays out again because of inflation. And then Bianco is saying that it's keeping it down. Well, but they're kind of saying the same thing if you think about it, because let's just say that Druckenmiller is saying that interest rates back in QE1 went from, and I'm talking about interest rates on the 10-year, went from, let's just, and I don't, these aren't exact numbers, but let's say they went from 3% to 4%, right? Well, Bianco, his argument could hold true there too. He could say that the reason that they didn't go to 5% was because of QE or because of QE infinity. So it's not that you see what I'm saying, because you're playing with two different cross currents there. You're playing with the additional demand for the bonds that QE is creating, but then you're also playing with inflation expectations. So Bianco is saying that because inflation expectations have risen so much, that QE has kept it at 60 basis points, where if we would have started, let's say, at 10 basis points, Druckenmiller could argue that QE took interest rates from up by 50 basis points, from 10 to 60. But it isn't necessarily QE, it's more the inflation expectations, see? So they're both right, but they're just kind of saying it in a different way. And in order to get and I know I'm just saying this off the cuff without a whiteboard, so what I just said is probably extremely confusing. I apologize. But I think the main takeaway is make sure that when you're trying to figure this out on your own, because that's what you're doing, rightfully so, that you're considering both of those cross currents. You're considering the additional demand from bonds by QE, but you're also considering the additional or less or a lower inflation expectation moving forward from the marketplace. Okay, next question. Derek, thank you for the super chat. Could you explain how Bitcoin can be an inflation hedge when it has no intrinsic value? I mean, I see how it can be an inflation hedge, but I don't know that it is an inflation hedge. I don't know that it's not an inflation hedge. We really don't have any history to determine. So how it could be an inflation hedge, look at Venezuela. Venezuela, their currency is just gone to dust. So if you had that happen with the dollar, not saying that it will, but if you did, I mean, you'd try to buy anything. I mean, coffee would be an inflation hedge, right? Any hard asset that you could potentially, that would maintain its purchasing power, cigarettes, weed, alcohol, who knows? Anything that you could get your hands on, you would, that has a physical component of it, where there's going to be future demand that you could trade for purchasing power. That goes back to the Macro Voices episode with Dr. Lacey Hunt. Remember that one? Where he was talking about if the Fed actually breached the threshold of the Federal Reserve Act to where they could create helicopter money, then he says the next step is a barter economy, and or an eventual step, kind of the end game, is a barter economy there. And so in that situation, I think that people would definitely buy Bitcoin. But that's what degree of inflation are we talking about? And so are we talking about 5% inflation in the CPI? I don't know if that's going to really drive people to Bitcoin. Maybe it will. But if we have 20% increase in the CPI, then is that good? That's why people would buy Bitcoin as an inflation hedge. And theoretically, it's limited to 21 million. So that's why I see it as a potential inflation hedge. Now, will it be an inflation hedge? That I have no idea. I have no clue. And that's why, to me, I like Bitcoin. I think it's fantastic. but I look at it as a pure speculation only. It is not digital gold. It's not insurance. It's speculation. And I think as long as you can compartmentalize not only Bitcoin but gold in your mind, and why they're different and what purposes they serve, then it'll help you make better decisions on whether or not to buy Bitcoin. All right, next question, please. Identity Block, thank you for the super chat. Hi, George. How was your experience with Act 20 and 22 and PR? Well, honestly, I'm getting re-signed up, if you want to call it that. I did it back in, I can't remember if it was 2013 or 14, something like that. I went through the motions, and as we speak, I've got the lawyers going through the paperwork and making sure everything's caught up, because I haven't been in Puerto Rico in a few years, and I don't know if there's certain stuff I needed to fill out, I didn't fill out, or it's been kind of out of sight, out of mind. But I'm planning on going back to Puerto Rico here when we're done with the cerveza sickness, and the some of the business entities I have now, running them out of Puerto Rico and calling that my home base again. And that doesn't mean I'm going to spend my whole life there. I don't like being tied down to one spot. I'm still going to be in Medellin. I'm still going to travel a lot. I'm still going to do those things, but calling that home base. And so as far as an experience, it's great. I don't know. I mean, it's kind of as long as you got some lawyers doing it for you and doing all the heavy lifting, so you don't have to deal with the paperwork and kind of the bureaucracy. It's fine. There's really no downside to it. The only downside is just you got to wait in line to get your driver's license and to register to vote. But it just, you can knock that out in a day or two. And compared to the benefit, I mean, it's a no-brainer. If you're making, I mean, just to keep the math easy, say you're making $1 million a year, and you go from paying $300,000, $400,000 in taxes down to almost nothing. I mean, that's for me, it's a no-brainer. And I would gladly wait in line 3 or 4 hours at the DMV to save $200,000 or $300,000 a year in tax legally. So I want to make sure that I'm clear there. I'm not suggesting anyone do anything that's not legal. But so yeah, I think that's my best answer. I've had a great experience with it. I think for the right person, it's a no-brainer. And you got to do some red tape stuff, wait in line a little bit, but that's nothing compared to the benefit. And I like Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is a lot of fun. If you like snorkeling and water sports like jet skiing and kite surfing and golf, and boy, there's a lot to like with Puerto Rico for sure. All right, next question, please. Luis, thank you for the super chat. Do you use occupancy rate to evaluate investment opportunities in Medellin, especially in areas where Airbnb increase your income? Yeah, you always have to look at occupancy rates. Whenever you're looking at an investment. What's weird about the real estate investing I do is I don't really consider occupancy rates too much, because I've kind of got the math in my head so much that I know how much of a return I need to make on my upfront investment to have enough of a buffer in there for the occupancy rate. So I'm never it's never part of my spreadsheet, but that's because I've been doing this for 8 years. So I kind of just automatically calculate it. For someone who was maybe less experienced, you definitely want that in your spreadsheet and in your numbers. And it's going to be wildly different. If you're looking at Airbnbs and Parquearas, I mean, if you've got the energy building, which, Lewis, it sounds like you're from Medellin. So if you look at the energy building, I mean, Brad manages that, Brad with Casa Cole, as you probably know, and their occupancy is like 100%. I mean, they're packed. You can calculate 100% occupancy. Of course, not during the cerveza sickness, but in normal times. But if you look at Joe Schmo Airbnb that doesn't have the kind of the brand as the energy, or it's kind of that, definitely doesn't have the visual appeal of the energy building, but it doesn't have that kind of reputation, that clientele already built up. I mean, you can't factor in 100%. You might be at 30%, especially now because there are all these hotels and there's a lot of competition for the Airbnbs at the, call it $40 or $50 a night price point. So your occupancy could be a lot higher. That's why whenever I invest in real estate, I always try to find a property that no one can replicate, that they can't produce any more of. So let me give you an example of that. What I try to do is I try to find properties within walking distance of Park Yeris and the Golden Mile, and like in the Provenza area. And I try to find them with some sort of distinguishing quality above and beyond the fact that they're walking distance, that they've got the location, that you'll never, ever find. So as an example, a view. And you know the views in Medellin are fantastic. But if you could get like a penthouse that's up on like the 15th or 20th floor that is within walking distance of Park Yeris, you know as well as I do, they're never making another one of those. Well, I'm not going to say that definitively, but it's going to be, the supply of that is going to be extraordinarily limited moving forward. Now, up the hill at Las Palmas, not so much. But that's not walking distance. You know, they got to deal with traffic. It's a nightmare to live up there for some people. So another distinguishing factor might be its proximity to Clínica Medellin, or maybe it's a huge penthouse. It's got a solid view, but it's got a big jacuzzi area, right? Where not a lot of penthouses nowadays have the big area for the jacuzzi. And from a structural standpoint, you can't just throw in a jacuzzi because it weighs a trillion pounds when you put the water in there. So you got to make sure that structurally you've got an area that can actually handle a jacuzzi. So that makes a property unique. So you've got this kind of penthouse it's got some nice space. You got a jacuzzi and your walking distance to the Golden Mile or Park Yeris, both. Then you've got something that they're just not going to produce any more of. And that's what, so all real estate's not created equal. Now, that said, if you go into some random apartment building on the second floor that was built back in the late 1980s, then they're dime a dozen, right? What distinguishes you from anyone else? And what prevents there from being more supply on the market? Nothing. You're a commodity. So make sure when you're investing in real estate, regardless of where you're investing, but especially in areas where you're trying the Airbnb play, you can't be a commodity. You've got to be unique somehow. Let me just make sure I answered. I went off on a tangent there, so I want to make sure I answered the entire question. Yeah, I did. Okay. All right, next question. Reveal 305 or Revival 305. Any thoughts on Barcelona or Costa Rica? Again, it's a function of price. As far as just the broad market, I would like Barcelona. Yeah, because I would assume that that you're able to get some good deals right there. Yeah, that could be interesting. Costa Rica, I don't like as much, because the prices in general were pretty inflated for what you're getting, and they're kind of gringo prices there, and I don't really like that. But that's not to say, remember, you make your money on the buy side. That if you were an expert in Costa Rica and you know the market very well, that you couldn't make a ton of money because you were able to buy right. But if I'm just looking at macro, I kind of like Barcelona a little bit better than I'd like Costa Rica, for sure. Now, that's not saying that I'd go in right now and buy in Barcelona, but I would definitely start snooping around and seeing what effects the cerveza sickness has had on the real estate market, and seeing maybe if they're starting to get some good deals there, or maybe you just start putting out the feelers. So in the next 6 months or the next year, you could get some really good deals, because Barcelona isn't going anywhere, right? It doesn't matter how bad well, to a certain degree, it doesn't matter how bad the economy gets in Europe and Spain. You're always going to have tourists going to Barcelona. You are. So if you can get a smoking deal, but not a commodity, remember, not a commodity, but a smoking deal on something that's going to be a fantastic asset for the next 20 years in an area that is going to be a heavy tourist attraction for not just the next 10 years, but probably the next 50 years, then I think that's a good idea. It's a good idea. And you're in, so I wouldn't worry too much about the euro, because you're in real estate. So you're in a hard asset, not really tied. I mean, to a degree, it's tied to the currency, but if you get some heavy inflation there or devaluation of the euro, you're in a hard asset. So it's not going to affect you as much as far as your purchasing power. So yeah, that's how I'd look at that. All right, next question. How do you limit TP? Thank you for the super chat. How do you limit losses in case you're wrong about an investment? Does using a stop loss go against your strategy of buying an asset when it's cheap? I don't know. Personally, I don't use stop losses, but I see value in using stop losses. See, me, I'm looking at if the conditions have changed dramatically. So I bought a Shell the other day. Well, you guys know that back in March, I bought quite a bit of it. And so if it went down to, let's say it was half price, it went down to 15. I don't know that I hit a stop loss. I'd buy more. Assuming that conditions hadn't changed. Now, if we get invaded by some sort of space alien that shows us how we've got this new energy source that's 10 times better than oil, and we don't need oil anymore, and I doubt that's electricity. I hope it'd be nice if it was electricity, but I don't know. But let's just say that happens, then yeah, then the fundamentals have changed substantially. But I don't know that I see it through the lens of a stop loss. But for some people, maybe it's a prudent play. I think it really depends on your mentality and why you're investing, why you're speculating. As far as how I limit losses, I make sure that 80% of my portfolio is paying me to own it. So I don't care about losses. Like with Shell, and I know they nixed their dividend, but maybe a rental property is a better example. If the value of my rental property gets cut in half, I don't care. I really wouldn't consider that a loss. I mean, I guess it is on paper, but I'm not owning the rental property for the property or for the value of the property. I'm owning the rental property for the cash flow. So as long as my cash flow isn't interrupted or isn't going down, I don't care what the value of the property is in the slightest, because I'm not investing for the value of the property. I could care less. It's like just kind of off there on the side. So that's how I limit and then I buy stuff when it's cheap, and I sell it when it's expensive. And I've got 10% gold, and I only speculate with 10% of my portfolio. So when you kind of think through the way I set up my investment strategy, it's really now you can take paper losses for sure, but it's not that easy to just lose actual money like or lose purchasing power, assuming that you're not selling. I know it's kind of weird because to a degree the paper losses would be a loss but they're only a loss if you sell, right? And if you've got positive cash flow coming in from those assets, you never have to sell. And so that allows you, that gives you a lot of leverage on when you can sell. You can always just wait for the market to turn around. And of course, that depends on you buying right. So it always goes back to buying things when they're cheap. You can't buy California real estate right now and say, oh, okay, at some point in time, it's going to come back around. No, because you're buying something when it's extraordinarily expensive and it might not come back around. But if you're buying, let's say the S&P 500 at a 5 multiple, then okay, you don't have much downside there. You got a heck of a lot of upside. But if you're buying the S&P at when the CAPE ratio is at 40, well, it may never come back to 40 because you're buying it at nosebleed levels, right? So it always goes back to that strategy. So as long as you set up your portfolio that way, you buy things when they're cheap, you sell them when they're expensive. 80% of your portfolio pays you to own it, and you've got 10% in gold. You can it's definitely possible, but it makes it a lot harder to lose money. And I think that's how I would answer that question. That's how I limit my losses. Okay, Sebastian, do we have any more super chats, buddy? Joe, thank you for the super chat. What small business would you start or buy this year? Online. Done. Next question. No, I'm joking, but that's a no-brainer, Joe. I've as an entrepreneur, and I don't know if I'd consider myself an entrepreneur anymore. But prior to 2012, when I kind of retired, if you want to call it that, I had several businesses, and most were just your brick and mortar, just your old school business. You've got an office, you've got clients coming in, you've got staff coming into the office every day. You've got huge startup costs. The one business I always use as an example, this was back in maybe 2006, something like that, right around there. At that time, I had about $100,000 saved up, and I had been in kind of in the entrepreneurial game for a few years. Had some things went well, some things didn't, but I had about 100 grand. And that wasn't near enough to start this business. And so I had to borrow another 400 because I needed 500 to start the business. And this is a business that ended up doing well. It threw off, I mean, I won't go into exact numbers, but it threw off at a certain point, it was throwing off over $1 million a year in profit. So now that said, you got a lot of headaches. You got 100 employees. There's a lot of gray hair involved in that $1 million a year, let me tell you. But my point is, if you look at a lot of these online businesses today, a lot of these young kids, they're crushing it. They're making $1 million a year with an out-of-pocket cost of like $100 just setting up a URL or web hosting or whatever it is. You know, check out my buddy Miles Beckler's YouTube channel. He gives away all this stuff just for free content, but he goes over these case studies and everything. I mean, and there's guys and gals that make a ton of money, like through selling stuff on Amazon or affiliate marketing, or it's just so many neat ways to do it. But it doesn't require you taking your life savings and then, in addition to that, borrowing another 400 grand and taking 500 grand and then just rolling the dice and just hoping that you start making revenue in 2 or 3 months and that you've got enough capital, you've got a long enough runway to last until you actually start turning a profit, and you don't need, and you can, and the business will survive. Whereas you can start, and let's say you can start an online business for $2,000, something like that. And let's say it doesn't work. Fine. Start another one. Start another one. Start another one. Start another one. Just keep throwing stuff up against a wall and see what sticks. And if you only got to spend $1,000, trust me, if unless you're crazy, after 10 tries, you're going to find something that makes money. If you're doing it right, and if you're doing the research, and if you're doing the work, and then it costs you 10 grand to find something that works, as opposed to 500, right? It's just in today's day and age, it's a no-brainer. And I'm not the only guy saying that. Listen to Kiyosaki, any of Robert's YouTube stuff, right? And almost every one of his videos, he'll have his phone and he'll say, if I had this, it says, the opportunity is right here. You've got opportunity to make $1 million right in the palm of your hand. And he's right. He's right. He's right. And you can't say, oh, well, maybe it's easier to start a brick and mortar business. It's not. Trust me, it's not. It is insanely hard and 10 times riskier for a lot less profit at the end of the day. All right. Unity Being, thank you for the super chat. Crypto folding currency backed by silver. Thoughts? I don't know why you wouldn't just buy silver. Crypto folding. Yeah, it's just a speculation, but you really, who knows if it has the upside of silver. Maybe it will because it's backed by silver, but maybe it won't. I don't know. I just, if I'm going to speculate, I'd rather just buy silver, personally. All right. I think that's it. Yeah, that's as well as I can answer the question. All right. Next, Sebastian, do we have any more super chats, buddy? John, thank you for the super chat. George, where do you buy your T-bills? Through the brokerage? It's Treasury Direct, yeah. Where do you store them safely to minimize a third-party risk and have guaranteed access? Well, I would just set it up with your brokerage. I mean, see, if you buy them through Treasury Direct, I'm not sure I fully understand your question, John. Third-party risk on a Treasury? I don't know how much third-party risk, unless you're talking about like rehypothecation. I think that's probably what you're talking about. But I don't know for sure. So I would try to just go direct to the government. I just use Treasury Direct. Okay. Next, Dave, thank you for the super chat. GD commodity and heat oil ETF multi-fund, maybe? Have guys, if you're sending me a super chat, make sure that it's not encrypted. Have non-qualified. How to living. Okay, let me try to figure this out here. I'm not sure what you're talking about with the GD gold commodity and heat oil ETF. Oh, mutual fund. Okay. Have non-qualified retire 400 grand, 62 Social Security to be 1,000. Okay. Move to the Philippines. Great. How to allocate funds, living expenses. Okay. So if I'm non-qualified, I'm not sure how the commodity and the mutual funds coming into play here, Dave. From what I'm getting, you've got 400,000 cash. I have non-qualified retirement, or maybe a retirement account. It seems like you've got 400 at your disposal, and you've got $1,000 a month coming in Social Security, and your expenses are 1,200 a month. So you need another 200 a month in cash flow to pay your expenses. So that's the first thing I'd think about is how can I. But see, if you're taking the 400 and you're separating it by 40 grand worth of physical gold, you've got 40 grand in speculation. And so that takes us to 80. So you got 320 in investments that pay you to own them. I think you're in a great position. I don't know if you can own property outright in the Philippines. I would imagine you can. If so, I'd try to pick up a rental property there in the Philippines that you could manage. And that would give you plenty of cash flow coming in to cover your expenses. And then with the rest, I'd just keep some dry powder to come across some smoking deals. This is what I'd do. Okay, here we go. Assuming that I'm understanding you correctly, Dave, I would take the 400. So what I'm saying, I do the gold, I do the speculative part of the portfolio. As far as speculation, what do? I would look at Chris's stuff, Chris McIntosh with Capitalist Exploit. I'm not saying we're an affiliate. So if you want to buy his research letter, you can do that on our website. You get about a 15% discount. But even if you didn't go that direction, I would start paying attention. I think Chris has like a free blog that he does too. I definitely sign up for that for sure. That's how I look at the speculative side. But as far as the 320, more importantly, I would keep most of it dry powder. I would assume that you can get something for maybe 100 grand in the Philippines that would throw off good cash flow. I'm not sure where you are, but assuming that you could, I'd buy a neat little property. Make sure you're do the research. Don't just go out tomorrow and buy it. Think about it. Do the comps. Do the cash flow. Do everything. Think it through for a good 6 months. Just start to look at properties. Just kick tires. Just do the research. And then I would buy a $100,000 property, and then I'd keep it for like a year, and just see how it goes. Just maybe you've never owned a rental property, so I'd self-manage if I could, and just maybe you do an Airbnb, but just try it. Just understand how it works and the pros and the cons. And then if it's something that you were really excited about and you thought, oh, this is easy, then maybe you do another one. If you're like, oh man, I never want to do this again, this sucks. Well, then you've got plenty of dry powder there to go into an asset class like dividend paying stocks, maybe in the Philippines, maybe in Asia, maybe in the United States if things are cheap. But then you can kind of go that direction. That's how I would tackle this problem. The great news is you've got $1,000 a month coming in, and your living expenses are only $1,200. So you only need to find 200 of positive cash flow quickly to make sure that you're not dipping into your savings for your living expenses, which would be my number one priority. Okay, next question. Lewis, thank you for the super chat. My friend, is Medellin linear or cyclical? I would say it's really linear. Yeah, it's linear. Most markets that don't have a lot of leverage in them are linear. And Lewis, I think you were the one that sent me the super chat about the Airbnb. And if so, it sounds like you know Medellin well. And you know that very few people have mortgages. Now, I know there's people in Sabaneta, and the younger people nowadays, a lot of them do have mortgages. But if you look at the entire housing stock, like 100% of it, most people, especially in Poblado and these areas, they own their property outright. And so you have very few mortgage payments. So it's tough to have ups and downs in the market where there's not much mortgage debt because there's very low liquidity. People just really don't buy and sell, and you can't really have a big run up in prices above and beyond inflation. If you look at Deanne has some number, and that's the tax authority in Colombia. They've got numbers going back to like 1998 on housing prices in Medellin, adjusted for inflation and in nominal terms. And if you look at them, they really, they go up and down a bit. I mean, you guys here in Medellin, as you probably know, you had the big problems in the early 2000s with Comuna 13 and or Barrio 13 and a lot of the drug activity over there. But now that's kind of wiped out of the system. And even right after that, the prices went right back up. And so although you have these periods of it going up and then going down and kind of back and forth, it pretty much just stays consistent with inflation. And as it should. And if you guys think about it, real estate really just should stay in. You really shouldn't make money on real estate other than on the buy side and through building equity and cash flow. If even in the United States, if you take it back, if you take from 1998 to 1900, so almost 100 years, I would go so far as to probably even take it to 2000. Housing prices in the United States for those 100 years, adjusted for inflation, went up by zero. Prices didn't change when you adjust for inflation and the size of the home. So real estate really doesn't go naturally. Now, of course, once you insert debt and lowering lending standards and central banks artificially lowering interest rates and all these things, and then you pump a ton of excess liquidity or additional debt into the market, then it goes way up above and beyond the rate of inflation. But it's really not natural. That's not what a real estate market is meant to do. And same thing on the downside. Yes, it can go down, but eventually you got supply and demand that kind of even things out. So my point is, since Medellin has very little debt in the mortgage or in the real estate market, it's a linear market in the sense that it's really just going to kind of go up over time with inflation. And so, not a cyclical market. Now, if we get a ton of lending come in, then maybe it could be a cyclical market like Europe. But right now, not even close. All right. Sebastian, we got any more questions, buddy? Last question for the day. And thank you for telling me that. That helps out. That's cool. I really like that ticker thing that goes across. That's really neat. Miguel, thank you for the super chat. Step number 2, more cowbell. Keep it coming. More cowbell. That's funny. Yeah, I appreciate it, Miguel. And thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you check out the website, georgegammon.com. There's a ton of content. There's a lot of stuff going on there. Make sure you subscribe to the email list. I'm going to start working on tomorrow's video, and I will see you guys on that video tomorrow. We'll see you then.